Politics and Culture, Lecture 2, The Long 18th Century Historians' Overviews. Okay, today we're going to be doing a bit of historiography that covers some of the main textbooks of this period, and we'll see how historians have changed their views about how to approach the 18th century over time. And we'll start with the first historians themselves from the Victorian era, who look back, actually not very far back, into the 18th century, and we tend to classify these as Whig historians, such as the most famous one, Thomas Babington Macaulay, T.B. Macaulay, who wrote voluminous books on the history of England, and he was the first one really to look at the 18th century, which was still near history to him. And one of his most famous books was a series of volumes called The History of England, the New Session of James II, published in 1848. And you can have a look at the link for the originals on the Gutenberg site. And thinking about this term Whig history, remember Whigs are the party who were in power in the 18th century, most of the 18th century, and they have a particular set of principles which these historians shared. So the characteristics of Whig history, as we'll discuss, include a belief in the balanced constitution, this idea that king, lords and commons should have a balance of power amongst themselves, and particularly celebrating the 1832 Reform Act, so the Reform Act that extended the franchise and reworked the electoral system to take account of the modern age. So Whig historians very much thought of themselves as modern, as progressive, as celebrating the glories of the British Constitution, and their focus is very much on political and constitutional matters. And so we might want to also talk about later historians as Whiggish, so who aren't subscribers to Whig principles necessarily, but follow the type of history that these early Whig historians wrote. So characteristics include very much a belief in progress, a belief that everything's getting better, that the whole purpose of history is to progress forward. So whereas other types of history think about cycles of decline, Whig history often thinks that things are getting better, particularly politically and constitutionally. And also they're defined by very much an Anglocentrism, the belief that England in particular, and often to the exclusion of Scotland and Wales, or just subsuming Scotland and Wales within the history of England, that England is the model that everyone should follow, and often reflecting the flavour of the times, are very imperialist, that the British Empire is a good thing, and that imperial expansion is also a sign of progress. But then we move on, and we sort of see the continuation of Whig history into the 20th century, but then, as we've seen throughout any module you do on British history, historiography changes from the 1950s, 1960s, and we see a growing emphasis on history from below and social history. So we're moving away from an emphasis on politics and the constitution into an emphasis on social history and the history of ordinary people outside Parliament. And one of the classic works of the 1960s was this book, The Making of the English Working Class, by E.P. Thompson, who was a Marxist historian, but changed his approach to what Marxist history should be by looking at the culture of ordinary people. And we'll have a look at what that book contains in the seminar. But the way that he looked at the 18th century is quite interesting because, as I said, he was a Marxist historian, but he challenged traditional Marxist interpretations by looking at what he called class struggle without class. And so he wrote an article in the late 70s, which is published in Social History, called 18th Century English Society Class Struggle Without Class. I recommend you read that and try and work out what does he mean by that strange phrase. He also wrote quite a lot of books on and articles on this idea of 18th century society as being plebeians versus patricians. So plebeians, the ordinary people. It's a bit of a derogatory term, we'll see why it was used. Against a patrician society, an aristocracy and gentry who believe themselves to be paternalist towards the lower orders. And as we'll see in an next seminar, there's lots of different ways of describing class and groups of people in the 18th century. And so he wrote a lot about rural society. Actually, you think of E.P. Thompson, Marxist historian interested in industrialisation, but he characterises the 18th century as a rural traditional society where the upper classes are trying to be paternalist to a plebeian class and how that conflicts with each other. It's a really interesting book called Whigs and Hunters, which I also recommend you read. When we get into the 1980s, again, historians tend to reflect the flavour of politics at the time, and we get a kind of revisionist backlash against the kind of left-wing social histories. And we'll discuss this book in detail, but this is English Society 1660 to 1832 by J.C.D. Clarke, and a very controversial book, still remains quite a controversial book. And although its title ostensibly says English Society, in fact it's a hark back to much more traditional characterisations of England in the 18th century as being dominated by politics. And you'll note also religion comes through in the title and in the contents of the book. And we'll discuss why the book is controversial and what you think of his way of characterising the 18th century. And there's the first page of the preface, which you might want to read. There's other important books which then came out in the 1990s. This is probably the most famous one by the recently deceased Paul Langford, A Polite and Commercial People, England 1727 to 1783. And its focus is very much on the middle classes and an increasing interest in the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, the middle orders in the 1990s. And this reflects another interest in historians, which we'll discuss in a later seminar, in the history of consumerism and consumption and luxury goods, which the middle classes excelled in having in the 18th century. And his focus very much on this idea that England was quite stable as a society in this period, and it was stable because the middle classes emphasised these values of politeness and of trade and commerce. There's also a renewed interest in war and military views of the 18th century. Remember that the 18th century, although ostensibly a period of stability, was also a century where we were at war quite a lot with various countries. And John Brewer's book came out in 1990 called The Sinews of Power, War, Money and the English State. And in some sense it's quite a traditionalist book. I've put there it's a structuralist book. It focuses on the structures of the state, of economics, of war and the military. And it's not quite a return to a Whiggish view, but it's a very different type of book from the old social histories of the 18th century. And Brewer popularised this term, the fiscal military state, to describe the 18th century. That this was a period when the British Empire expanded, that the economy expanded in response to imperial trade and later industrialisation, and the two big structures of the economy and the military combined to produce a very strong political system. Another follow-on from that book was Linda Colley's Britain's Forging the Nation, 1707 to 1837, was published in 1992. A very hugely popular book. And this is the first one really to reflect a growing interest in British identity rather than English. You will see that all the previous books are very much Anglo-centric, whereas this one's emphasis is on Britishness. In some respects, it's got very similar arguments to Brewer's, in that it's focusing very much on war and empire as a key feature of British history in this period. But it's emphasising very much that war and empire and also religion created a sense of Britishness, that this was the first period that people in the British Isles started to think of themselves as British. And so we'll be discussing again what you think of that theory.